I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. Before I introduce my guest, a little story. And this isn't the first I'm introducing, but Jim Rickards, the four-time best-selling financial author, came on my site a few years ago, and he said, "What's the Federal Reserve going to do? Are they going to take their $4.5 trillion balance sheet and double it?" And the answer is yes. And to talk about that cartoon land that we're calling the Fed Reserve policy, I figured I'd have someone on who actually knows a little bit about monetary policy, and that is Paul Craig Roberts, who is the former Assistant Treasury Secretary, PhD in economics. He invented trickle-down economics, but this is more like a cascade of cash. Paul Craig Roberts, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
It's a pleasure, Greg.
What is your, is it, am I just being Chicken Little, or are they printing a whole lot of money that's going to have a negative effect on inflation and bonds and everything else? Just tell me what you think.
Well, they're printing a whole lot of money. It's going into the prices of financial assets, but that's been going on now since 2008. So the money hasn't really driven up consumer prices. It's driven up the prices of bonds and stocks. And we see that even in the midst of this economic and health crisis, the Dow Jones is still at 23,000. So where the money goes is to bail out the financial system. And they did this before, as you know. That's what QE was, and now they're doing it again. Of course, when I was in the Treasury, monetary policy wasn't conducted in this way. You didn't bail out people whose misbehavior had produced troubles, not only for them, but for the overall system. But today, the system is bailed out, in part because they stopped enforcing the antitrust laws, the laws against concentration, and allowed the biggest banks in the world to merge. And they had this dogma that financial markets are self-regulating and don't need regulators. So they got a whole bunch of highly risky derivatives and leveraged them to the hilt. In fact, banks, the big banks in general, they no longer perform any real economic function. They don't lend to business and help business invest in productive capacity that expands employment and output. They lend to financialize everything. They lend money to buy existing financial assets. And so what we're seeing here again is they're trying to bail out debt again by issuing more debt. Whereas the problem is there's already more debt than can be serviced. So that's why they're trying to bail it out by issuing more debt. So it's like kicking a can down the road until it blows up. And when does it blow up? It didn't blow up at 4.5 trillion Federal Reserve balance sheet. Will it blow up at 10 trillion? Or does it have to be 15 trillion? Or does the Fed's balance sheet have to be the size of the US GDP before it blows up? I can't say that I know, but I do know that bailing out debt by creating more debt is not a solution. The solution is the one that used to be applied to countries that got over-indebted, countries that took on more debt than they could service with their foreign exchange earnings. And in those cases, the debt was written down to a level that the countries could service. That's what needs to be done here. The debts the debts, corporate and personal debts, student loans, credit card debt, mortgage debt, corporate debt. These debts need to be written down to a level that the people who have the debts can service. So you need a debt jubilee. Debt jubilees were once widely used in the ancient world because the way economies tend to work is that through time debts expand and people get more and more indebted, and before long they don't have any discretionary income and they can't buy any increase in output and they can't service their debts, and so either the system goes into collapse or you write the debts down and start over. So that's what I think. I think that Michael Hudson is correct, that we need a debt jubilee, that the debts need to be written down, not all the way, but written down to a level that they can be serviced. If students can't service their student loan debt, they have to be written down to some level that they can be serviced. The same with credit card debt, the same with mortgage debt, the same with corporate debt. You see, we've had years now of corporations using the entirety of their earnings plus borrowings to buy back their own stock. So they have indebted themselves in order to decapitalize their own companies. This is ridiculous. They did it because that's how they boosted the current income of the executives. Their pay is not really a salary they get, it's in the bonuses they receive for performance. And performance means raising the stock price. So if you buy back your own stock, you raise the stock price. And the shareholders are happy because they get capital gains. And so the system has been working not for the economy, but for a tiny handful of people who are share owners and whose incomes are dependent on increases in the price of the company's stocks. So, and the banks, what do the banks do? They lend for purchase of existing financial assets, for leveraging existing assets even more. It's been a long time since the big bank lent in order to expand productive capability of the real economy. And so when you have a financial system that works that way, then it's not working for the economy. It's working for a tiny handful of people who are reaping paper profits off of these various financial manipulations. So bailing it out a second time is simply telling them, okay, you can continue doing this. And assuming this bailout succeeds, I mean, we don't know if it will, then we'll have a third bailout because the behavior hasn't changed. There'll be no change in behavior. They're suffering no punishment, no price for misbehavior. In fact, they're being taken care of, so they will continue to operate in this way, assuming this is successful again. So as I see it, to sum up, to repeat myself, what we need is a write-down of debt. This is the way countries used to get their house in order. You may remember the Brady bonds. Nicholas Brady, the Secretary of Treasury, and the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, wasn't it? Yes. And the Mexicans announced they couldn't pay their debts. And so he created this Brady bond thing, which simply was a write-down of the debts to the level that they could pay. And the problem went away. And so I think that's the way you have to deal with it. And you can't simply just write off the debts of the banks and the corporations. You've got to do it for the American people. If you have a situation where debt service for the average American household, their credit card debt, their mortgage debt, their car debt, and if they're sharing if they signed on their kids' student loans, they've got that debt. This leaves households with no discretionary income. They haven't a cent to spend on goods and services other than the basics. That, they pay the mortgage, they pay the utilities, they provide food. So the economy can't grow. It can't go. There's no consumer income to drive the economy. They can't go any further in debt in order to get money to spend. So this calls for a debt jubilee. They need to write these debts. We need to write these debts down. It's the only way you can solve a problem like this. Otherwise, you just have to let it go into collapse and see who picks up the pieces.
So that's obviously, nobody's doing that. I think they ought to go after the endowments of these colleges for the student loans. I mean, they bellied them up to the bar and said, "Oh yeah, the money's cheap. Go ahead." And while they got their, all their, their pensions and their benefits for life and whatever. But anyway, I digress. But so it doesn't look like they have. Go ahead.
Let me play on that, because that's an interesting thing, a point you raised. As I understand it, since the Fed is bailing out the creditors anyhow, why does it matter if the creditors take a loss on the loans? The Fed's bailing them out of the other losses. So whoever's holding the student loans, if they're simply told, okay, they're cut in half, we've written them off 50%, they're bailed out anyhow. So why not do it in a way that benefits the economy? All of a sudden, students have, or former students, have the possibility of some discretionary income. The debts can be serviced, but they've got still some money in their pockets. Why not do the same thing for auto debt, for credit card debt, for mortgage debt? The Fed's bailing out the creditors anyhow. So why does it hurt to let ordinary people benefit from the bailout? The creditors are bailed out, period. Why only bail them out due to their highly leveraged debts that they have accumulated? So you don't really need to go to the endowments. Of course, I don't have any objection to them going to the endowments, but you don't need to pay for it if you're bailing it out. The Fed's bailing it out. It's in that $10 trillion balance sheet.
Didn't it look like they're going to do that, though? So you're saying that if they don't do it, we get a collapse? Is that, you think that, so what's the handicap here? Are we going to more likely get a bailout like you talk about? I don't hear anybody talking about that. Or are we just going to get this thing in a money printing vortex into collapse? I mean, what do we get?
Well, if this bailout works, we will get another bailout like the one we had 10 years ago.
And if it doesn't work?
First, let's assume it does work. That means no behavior has changed. The financial system will continue its erroneous path, and the American population will have no discretionary income to spend on goods and services, because they're so heavily indebted, they can't get any more in debt. And so the economy can't move, it can't grow, but the financial speculation of the big banks and the financial system can continue. And so then it will again crash, and then they got to bail it out again. Now, if the bailout doesn't work this time, and they don't do anything to reduce the debt load on the economy, and I'm not talking about the federal debt. You see, the federal debt can always be paid because the government can print the money to redeem its bonds. But individuals can't print money to redeem their mortgages, their car payments, their student debt, their credit card debt, and corporations can't print money to redeem their corporate bonds. So those are the important debts that need to be forgiven. It's the private debts. Now, not all the debts, but they have to be written down to a level the corporations can pay on the bonds, that individuals can pay on their debts. That's the debt that has to be written down. If you don't write that down, even if this bailout succeeds the second time, there's no discretionary income anywhere in the economy to drive consumer demand. There's no way to sell any more goods and services. People are indebted up over their eyes. We hear over and over that a huge percentage of people live hand to mouth, that 40% or more of the population can't raise $400 cash. You can see what the current virus situation with the close downs and the layoffs and all of that is doing. It's causing an absolute catastrophe. They have to do it, they think, in order to stop the escalating spread of the virus. It's so infectious that you can get far more people infected, and you don't know whether they got a bad case or a good case. You don't know that in advance. It overwhelms the health system. There's no hospital beds. The other people who've got other kinds of illnesses, heart attacks or whatever, they can't get treatment because the whole thing's overwhelmed. So they have to do this to try to control the incidence of infection. But the effects on a heavily indebted population are dramatic. And so they need to address those, but they only think about the financial system. And why is that? Because the people who are making these decisions are the ones whose interests are at stake in the financial system. The New York Fed is the operating arm of the Federal Reserve, and who are the directors of the New York Fed, the executives of the big New York banks. So they're going to be sure they look after themselves. And then you have their lobbying power and all the rest. But fixing them doesn't fix the problem. The problem is that the private sector has got more debt than it can service. And so if they actually want to fix the problem, they've got to address that. If they just want to paper over it again with another $4 or $5 trillion in money, that's what they're trying to do. Maybe it'll work again for a while, but as no behavior is altered, because no one suffered from the misbehavior that produced this trouble, and as the economy is burdened with debt that it can't service and therefore hasn't got any money to drive an increase in aggregate demand to buy more goods and services, the economy can't grow. And so they're not fixing the problem by creating more debt to bail out existing debt. That doesn't fix the problem. They've got to get rid of debt. And again, it's not the federal debt that we should be worried about. They can print all the money they want to redeem U.S. Treasury bonds or bills and bonds. But individuals and corporations can't print money to get rid of their debt, and that's where the problem is. And you're right, they're not addressing the problem. So what happens if you don't address the problem? You're asking me. And to repeat, either you paper it over successfully again until you have another trouble, or you don't succeed and everything blows up.
So gold is been, in the last several months, I think it's up $300 or $400 year over year. It's at 17 and change. They're watching this cartoon show. Do you think gold is reflecting a little nervousness about all the money printing, the price of gold going up?
Yes, of course. Of course it is. Because you see, the question, in the previous bailout, it didn't affect the dollar. The question is whether this bailout, on top of the previous one, is going to affect the dollar. Are people going to say, good heavens, do we really want to hold dollar when they're creating so many? And so people saying, we don't know how that's going to play out, but they can't print gold, so let's get in gold. So yes, that's a function. On the other hand, if they succeed again in bailing out the debt by creating more debt, and the stock market goes back up, as it's been doing, then people will say, well, yeah, let's stay in dollars. Look, the stock prices are going up again. And then that takes the pressure off the dollar. So I don't know exactly how people are going to see this, but you're right that the enormous additional money creation no doubt worries some. On the other hand, if this money creation flowing into the prices of financial assets drives up their prices, then everybody says, yeah, well, the dollar's good. Look, the prices are up. And so they will stick with dollars. So it's, if they're successful in reflating the equity prices, they've already got the bond prices up, then the problem of the dollar is over for now. But as I said, it starts the whole game going again, because the behavior that produced the massive debt overhang hasn't been corrected. It's been bailed out. So everybody says, well, we can keep doing it. So we'll get a third time. In other words, if you bail it out, if you bail out debt by creating more debt, that's kicking the can down the road. How far can you kick it? We don't know until it doesn't kick any further.
Is this time different? I mean, the last time, 08, 09, we didn't destroy 40% of the demand for fuel. And I mean, did we demand 30 or 40% for the demand for everything? I mean, Dick's Sporting Goods, 800 stores, 40,000 employees. Bye-bye. Is Sears going to open up? Is JPC Penney's going to open back up? Are they, what about all these other stores that are just laying off that are probably never going to open back up? Some will, some won't. I mean, we've destroyed a lot of demand out of the economy. Can you talk about the demand destroyed out of the economy this time around as opposed to the last time around?
Well, last time they weren't the close downs. Yeah, because we didn't have coronavirus. So we didn't have close downs. So the bailout last time was easier. But I've addressed this already. I've pointed out that, yeah, the close down, the economy will be closed down if people haven't got any money. And you're talking about them not having any money because they've lost jobs. And that's true. I mean, there are predictions of 30, 40% unemployment. I don't know what it will come to. It really depends on how long the economy stays closed down. There's a big debate and argument about that. And Trump says he wants to open it at the end of this month. He wants to open it by May 1st. Other people are saying, oh, you can't do that. The virus is still here. And so we don't know. But of course, the sooner it's opened, the less the cost of closed downs in terms of people not having jobs and income. But the point I'm making is, even when they have jobs, they don't have any discretionary income, because their entire income goes to their mortgage, their utilities, their car or truck payment, their credit card bills, and student loans. And so there's no extra money to go out to stimulate the economy with purchases. So already we were in a situation where the economy couldn't grow. Now, we add to that close downs, shutdowns. And as you say, some of these may not reopen because they'll go bankrupt because they haven't got a revenue flow, but they've got costs. So if you add to that, to a situation in which there's no discretionary spending power in the population, then it's even worse. And so not only can the economy not grow, it shrinks. And that's why they talk about a Great Depression, another Great Depression. So we already have an economy that can't grow because of the indebtedness, the private indebtedness. We have an economy that businesses have not invested in for years. They've instead bought back their own stock. And now this economy, which was already, on the edge, is faced with massive close downs and massive unemployment. And so even more income is going to disappear. And so there's going to be shrinkage. And how much? Who knows? It could be terrible, or it could be it opens up quick enough and enough people get small businesses, medium-sized businesses, get loans. The banks suspend mortgage payments for a while. It's possible, but then we're still left with the large problem that the debt is there. It hasn't been written down, and the financial system is continuing to create more debt. So unless you address the problem, it's going to persist in one way or another and worsen. It's like this time around, we agree, it's worse than the previous time because we got close downs on top of the debt crisis. So I can't say for sure how bad it'll be or how lucky they'll be in the short term, but we can say they are not addressing the real problem, which is the extreme level of indebtedness. You have an economy that is mired in debt, and now that economy is losing employment and incomes, and so the debts become even less payable. If you can't hardly pay your debts while you're employed, how can you pay them when you're unemployed? So if you get 30% unemployed people, what the hell does that do to mortgage debts, to credit card debt, to auto debt? You can see it's a crisis much bigger than we are experiencing at the present time. But it's sitting there, growing, it's waiting. And so I say we have to address the debt issue. And of course, if the economy has to stay closed down or we all die of some virus, we're going to die from starvation. If the food chain closes down, the food supply, we see already the meat, a lot of the big meat companies have closed their plants. We read reports of farmers plowing under their vegetables, and we hear reports of dairy farmers having to pour out their milk, and that's not a way to survive in business. You don't get, when you aren't paid for the produce that you produce, instead have to destroy it, and you're losing money hand over fist. So it's a very serious situation. How long can it stay closed down before the food chains are gone? And then you go to the grocery store and you find out there's less and less, and there's less and less. And it's not a pleasant picture that one can give any happy prognosis about. So,
do you think we're in a great
days? It could be the end days.
Could be the end days.
Yeah, could be.
Do you think we're in a greater depression?
I think the possibility of a greater depression exists because of the enormous private debt overhang. Once again, it's been a principle of economics for my lifetime that economies are driven by consumer spending. If people don't have any money to spend, there's nothing to drive the economy. And so when they're so indebted that they have no discretionary income, that means they have no money to spend. They're hard pressed just to cover their bills. And so if we add to that 30% unemployment from close downs, then we have a far worse situation. They couldn't pay their bills when they had jobs, and now they haven't got jobs. So the problem of paying the bills gets bigger. And so the debt can't be serviced. And so what do? You just let this thing implode? Or do you stand up and say, we're writing down debts, we're bailing out the creditors anyhow? That's what the Fed's doing. And so why does it matter how much they're bailed out? But we're writing down the debts. And then, actually, let me add to this.
Sure.
Let me add to this.
Go ahead.
In my view, they should use these bailouts simply to nationalize the firms. If you've bought all of the bonds of a corporation, essentially you own it. You should just nationalize it. And this would have a huge advantage, particularly with the banks. They should nationalize the banks, because once they're nationalized, they can be broken up.
Start over.
Reagan can be separated from Chase Manhattan like they should be. You can reestablish Glass-Steagall just by separating commercial from investment banking. You don't have to go through the political process. You can break these things down, and then you can re-privatize them. You can sell them off. And if you nationalize all these corporations you're having to bail out, you can bring the jobs home from Asia. The public, the government now owns them. And so they simply bring the jobs home. And so all of a sudden, all the middle class jobs that disappeared over the last 2 decades, they're back. They're high productivity, high value added jobs. They produce middle class incomes. All of a sudden, again, the country has disposable income. People have money to spend because they get jobs that pay their bills and leave something left over. So you see, everybody says, oh, that's socialism. No, that's how you redeem a lost situation. It's nationalization. You break up the banks that they let get too big because they did not enforce the antitrust laws. You break up commercial from investment banking again, as it was under Glass-Steagall before the bloody idiots got rid of Glass-Steagall. I mean, this was the greatest error in human history, financial, economic error. It's why we have all this trouble. You can do all of these things once they're nationalized because there's not any corporations lobbying against you. They're not paying off the Congress. So you just do it because you're the government, you've got them. Okay, we're bringing home all of the Apple jobs from China, all of the Nike, Levi Strauss, all the jobs are coming back. Then the economy's transformed again in a good way instead of the bad way. You see, globalism essentially destroyed first world economies by moving the high value added, high productivity jobs offshore where labor was cheap. So the low-cost labor went into the profits of the corporation. What did they do with those profits? Did they go out and invest in the United States? No, they brought back their stock. They bought their stock back. They drove up the stock prices. They drove up their incomes. If this is capitalism, you can have it. It's the worst possible economic system, the way it's operating. So you have to fix that. If you don't fix it, the problem's not going to go away. They may paper it over, as I said. It may get papered over again for a short while.
You wrote about, that's actually brilliant. Did you just think that up as we were talking? You just thought that up as we were talking, didn't you?
No, I've written about
this.
Oh,
you read? Okay, all right. But that's just okay, so utterly brilliant is what I wanted to say.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I just all of a sudden, bing, Helen Keller, water, bring the banks, break them up, take control of them, sell them off, break them up, sell them off. Wow. No political, no, we own them. Thank you. You're done. We're going to start over. Woo.
That's exactly it. That's the opportunity. But you see, they don't see it because the guys running the show are the ones that have the stake in being bailed out.
Yeah. Yeah. Got that. It's utterly brilliant. I just wanted you to end on one thing. I just wanted to kind of bring this up. It's one of your most recent. You're a prolific writer at your website. Western billionaire control of democracies must be resisted. Could you just talk a little bit about this? Western billionaire control of democracies must be resisted. I know you bring up Bill Gates and Soros and all kinds of other people. Just talk about that. Why should we resist that?
Well, they create the world they want, which is not in our interest. Look, I think that particular article, what I'm emphasizing is that they're talking about now having an internal passport that you are cleared of the virus, and if you don't have this clearance paper, well, you can't renew your driver's license. You can't go to the grocery store. You can't go to events that have crowds. All of this type of stuff. We used to criticize the Soviets for having internal passports, and now Bill Gates and Fauci want us to have internal passports. Why? What is the purpose? Because Bill Gates wants to have everybody vaccinated against everything, and against coronavirus, even though there's no vaccination. And even though many experts say the vaccination could be extremely dangerous and could actually cause the virus to be more successful. There's all these uncertainties, but they're in this vaccination business. The big pharma, they get rich. They don't want a cure if they can get a vaccination. This is why there's so much resistance to using the proven anti-malarial drugs that you said at the beginning of our session today are used by a majority of the doctors.
Yeah, we were talking in the off camera about hydroxychloroquine and zinc and a Z-Pack, which thousands of doctors, this is not just some tinfoil hat, doctors are on board. Some of the biggest infectious disease doctors, one of them is in France, got a big study, works. Other ones here works. The rheumatoid, big doctor out in California is one of the biggest lupus practices, say there's very low side effects for hydroxychloroquine. He's got 2,000 patients on it. Especially for, it affects nil, just to give you some backup, nil effects for, 6 days of dose. He's got people on it for years. But anyway, but you think that this Western billionaire thing, this is bad for control and liberty and the Constitution and freedom?
Sure, and for health. Bill Gates was kicked out of India for paralyzing 500,000 kids with his polio virus vaccine. The South Africans have denounced him as a ruthless criminal for what the damage he did to their young people. I assume that when governments make these kinds of charges against an individual, they have grounds for it. So when you see Big Pharma and all of its media shills like CNN and Fauci and the CDC and NIH, and they're all beating up on Trump for saying, hey, these anti-malarial drugs seem to work, let's use them. And they're all beating up and they're claiming, oh, there's no evidence, there's no proof, and yet they're working. As you said, the doctors are using them and they're saving people from the virus. So why are they doing that? Because they don't want a cure, they want a vaccine. They can't make any money out of a drug that's been around for decades, that's been used for decades to treat arthritis, lupus, malaria, without killing anybody. What does it cost? A penny a dose or something like that, $1 a dose. There's no money in that for them. They want to have a big vaccine. And so to make a huge market, they have to mandate it. And so how they mandate it? Well, you can't do anything if you don't have the paper that you've been stuck. And yet we know from all the reports coming in, there was one yesterday from South Korea, that people get reinfected. You don't get it. Everyone doesn't get immunity from having had the virus. It varies. Some people do, some don't. The South Koreans announced, I think it was yesterday, that they had 51 people they had just cleared who are already reinfected. So what's the worth of the certificate that you're cleared? It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And so why is Gates pushing it and Fauci saying, well, we may have to do that. It may be a good idea because it locks you in to being vaccinated. Otherwise, you can't move. you stay locked down in your home. You can't go anywhere. You can't get your driver's license renewed. The kids can't go to school, et cetera, and so on and so on. So this is the kind of control that that article is talking about. Now, of course, the controls go far beyond that. There are many other ways they want to control us, but that's what that article was about. If you require people to have a vaccine that is already negated by the fact that
Hey, listen, we're going to cut you off right now. Hey, doctor, listen, I just want to talk about that. Hold on just a minute. I just want to, you got somebody there coming. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, it's paulcraigroberts.org. Please donate to his site. No commercials on there. He works hard at it. You're an award-winning journalist, former Assistant Treasury Secretary. Let me get all this in. Dr. Roberts, I loved it. Thank you for coming on. I need to have you on earlier and more often, but thank you, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, for coming on and straightening us out on the cartoon network of the Federal Reserve and this forced vaccination. Thank you very much for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com. I appreciate it.
Okay, Greg. Thanks for sharing your audience.
Okay, thanks for being on. I really appreciate it. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, drpaulcraigroberts.org. Thank you for joining us on USAWatchdog.com.